Welcome to the Digital Determinants Podcast, where we delve into the complex, systemic reasons behind the presence of digital inequity and the challenges surrounding digital adoption within communities comprising generations from the Great Migration. This podcast will explore the impact of trust on digital participation, the implications of digital discrimination, and the unique challenges faced by descendants of the Great Migration in embracing digital technologies. Join us as we unravel the historical, social, and technological factors contributing to this phenomenon and explore potential solutions to bridge the digital divide and promote inclusive digital adoption. Hello, I am back. Thanks for your patience as it's been a bit of a challenge. Life has been lifing, and for those of you who are working in the digital equity space, you know that we've been heads down working on the NTIA Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program application. So that got turned in on September 23rd, and we are sending good luck up not only for the Cook County application, but for all the other wonderful and needed programs that were proposed in this moment. So, to the Digital Determinants Podcast, because that's why you tuned in. Episode 4 is going to take you on a timeline. So, the Great Migration occurred between 1916 and 1970, and historians have split that time into two waves. The first occurring between 1916 and 1940, and that is going to be the focus of today's episode. I want to set the stage about who already lived in Chicago prior to the Great Migration. And I think that story is important because as we're talking about a people movement and all the things and all the coordination and the people, the places, the resources that had to be allocated when the city of Chicago consumed such a large demographic of folk from the South. I think it's important to talk about who was already here and a little bit about what they were doing while they were here. Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, stated to be from Saint Dominique, now known as modern-day Haiti, is regarded as the first permanent non-native settler of what would become known as Chicago. And he is recognized as the city's founder. The site where he settled, which is near the mouth of the Chicago River around 1780, is memorialized as a National Historic Landmark, and it's now located in what's known as Pioneer Court. DuSable was of African descent, but little else is really known about his life prior to the 1770s. So DuSable is first recorded as living in the mouth of the Chicago River in a trader's journal of early 1790. By then, he had established an extensive and prosperous trading settlement in what later became the city of Chicago. He sold his Chicago River property in 1800 and moved to the port of St. Charles, where he was licensed to run a ferry across the Missouri River. Fugitive slaves and freedmen established the city's first Black community in the 1840s. There were approximately 1,000 African Americans living in Chicago in 1860 per records. Following the end of the Reconstruction in 1877, African Americans flowed from the Deep South into Chicago, raising the population from approximately 4,000 in 1870 to 15,000 in 1890. So pre the Great Migration, there had already been some migration things happening from the South, not as large of population of people, one would say, but certainly a significant amount of people shifting coming from other places into Chicago. And these are Black people I'm speaking about specifically. During this time, Chicago also experienced an influx of immigration from overseas countries like France, Scotland, Norway, Ireland, England, Bohemia, and Austria. I want to briefly highlight the Irish immigration story to Chicago because it does show up prominently in this episode later on. So in 1880, Ireland immigrants started to arrive in Chicago. These Irish immigrants worked on the construction of the canal connecting Chicago with the Illinois River. So they came here and they had some work, which certainly is a good thing when you are moving from one place to another place. The nearby neighborhood that they settled in at the time was called Canalport, which is later known as Bridgeport. And Bridgeport, significantly, was the power base of 5 20th century Chicago mayors. That's important to note that the Irish immigrants that came to Chicago and settled into Canalport, now known as Bridgeport, and Bridgeport really was like the feeder community for leadership in the city of Chicago. So by 1900, Chicago had the 4th largest Irish population in America. That's behind New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia. Now, during the first wave of the Great Migration, again, 1916 to 1940, Chicago again also received other overseas immigrants coming to the city. In the 1920s, it was Russia. So many Russian immigrants were Jews who fled the persecutions happening in their country, and a large population settled on Devon Avenue in the East Rogers Park neighborhood, which today is now home to a large South Asian and Indian population. In the 1930s, it was Germany. So Germans flooded into Chicago for over a century, from the mid-19th century through World War II. Lincoln Square is where the Germans settled in droves, and it still maintains a strong German identity, the Lincoln Square community. In the 1940s, Sweden immigrants came. They settled into Andersonville and that neighborhood in the 19th century. Chicago had the largest Scandinavian settlement in the U.S. at that time. Then we had the Black Southerners migrating to Chicago, primarily from Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. Now, I'm going to start this timeline walking through the leadership of what was happening during that time, nationally, and locally, because not only was it fascinating, but it does lend itself to the story that we're trying to tell about the Great Migration, the recipient cities starting in Chicago, and then the opportunities and learning around those experiences and how it can lend itself to presencing solutions that can help us advance digital equity. So I'll start the timeline with the President of the United States during this wave of the Great Migration. And that president was Woodrow Wilson. So President Wilson served for 2 terms as the 28th President of the United States from 1913 to 1921. He was a member of the Democratic Party. He also served as the president of the esteemed Princeton University and was the governor of New Jersey before winning the 1912 presidential election. He was the leading architect of the League of Nations, and his progressive stance on foreign policy is well known. During his first year as president, Wilson authorized the widespread imposition of segregation inside the federal bureaucracy, and his opposition to women's suffrage drew protests, as they should. Wilson changed the nation's economic policies and led the United States in World War I in 1917. World War I, or the First World War, which was from July of 1914 through November of 1918, also known as the Great War, was a global conflict between 2 coalitions, the Allies and the Central Powers. Fighting took place mainly in Europe and in the Middle East, as well as in parts of Africa and Asia Pacific. And in Europe, which was characterized by trench warfare and the use of artillery, machine guns, and chemical weapons, basically gas as a weapon of mass destruction. World War I was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, resulting in an estimated 9 million military dead and 23 million wounded, plus up to 8 million civilian deaths from causes including genocide and other issues. The movement of large number of troops and civilians was a major factor in spreading the Spanish flu pandemic, which killed millions. The Spanish flu killed over 8,500 people in Chicago between September and November 1918. So moving to local politics, let's talk about Chicago mayoral election of 1915, where Republican William Hale Thompson defeated Democrat Robert Schweitzer. Thompson was a former Cook County commissioner and a former Chicago alderman. And that's also an interesting point as we talk about our mayoral system in the city of Chicago and many of the leadership positions, state reps and senators and others, they often found their way to other political positions by proxy of being a Cook County commissioner or being a Chicago alderman. So this was the first mayoral election to take place in Chicago after Illinois granted partial, not full, but partial women's suffrage, enabling women to vote in the Chicago mayoral elections, among other elections. Now, the mayor at the time, William Hale Thompson, was known as Big Bill. He was the most recent Republican to have served as the mayor of Chicago, meaning since Big Bill, there hasn't been a Republican mayor in the city of Chicago. Historians rank Big Bill among the most unethical mayors in American history, mainly because he had a very open alliance with Al Capone. And we know about Al Capone and Al Capone's reign of criminal activity and inappropriate political connections in the city of Chicago. It's a well-known story. However, others have recognized the effectiveness of Big Bill's political methods and publicity-oriented campaign, acknowledging him as a political chameleon and an effective political machine. Now, for those of you, you know, we're right in the middle of a political season for our presidential election this year in 2024. So Big Bill being a political chameleon seems to fit into the spirit of what's been happening currently in our political landscape. He was also at the forefront of the movement for the Chicago Public Library System and education officials to censor and ban many texts and historical recollections coming from the United Kingdom. So we've been dealing with library book bans as well, and it certainly is something that is relevant and prevalent as we talk about digital equity in library spaces. So it's interesting that in this historical recollection that I'm providing for you today, that the mayor of Chicago back then had a role in book banning in our public libraries here in our region. So during this time, Chicago experienced growth in its built environment. Our Navy Pier, and if you come to Chicago and you've seen our big Ferris wheel, that's where Navy Pier is. It was being built in 1916. And they called Big Bill, in addition to his nickname of Big Bill, they also called him Big Bill the Builder because of his big plans of building and expanding our built environment in the Chicagoland area. Also, in that time, the Chicago White Sox won the World Series in 1917. Super exciting. Now, 1919 was a very eventful year for Chicago and in the world. So Big Bill won re-election in 1919, winning a four-way race against Democrat Robert Schweitzer, who of course was the opponent that he defeated in the previous round of election. There was another independent candidate and a Labor Party candidate. And it's interesting around this story. In this story is interesting around what the folks were doing who were running against Big Bill. So Schweitzer was the incumbent Cook County clerk, and the independent candidate, McClay Hone, was the incumbent Cook County state's attorney. And then the Labor Party candidate, John Fitzpatrick, was a trade unionist. So in this time, in my research, and I haven't been able to really substantiate it through any other journal or scientific research document, but it appears, at least from the voter roll of that time, that Thompson, Big Bill, had a strong appeal to African American voters in Chicago. And I'm really unsure why. I don't know why he was the candidate of choice among the residents of Chicago at that time, the Black residents of Chicago at that time, but he was pretty popular for whatever reason. And this support attracted attacks from Democrats that resided in those white South Side neighborhoods. So Thompson in this time also, in addition to, I would say, in having a lot of support from the African American community, he also made a lot of efforts in his campaigning to attract and appeal to the Germans and the other European immigration groups. Now, in July 27, the Chicago Race Riot occurred. The Chicago Race Riot was a violent racial conflict between white Americans and Black Americans that began on the south side of Chicago, and it ended on August 3rd. So it went from July 27th and ended on August 3rd of 1919.
Well, the 1919 race riots have left a significant mark on Chicago's psyche. It's still something that we talk about all the time.
In 1919, Chicago was just one place in a world being reshaped by war and immigration. But that global turmoil provided the backdrop to a local eruption of violence. It was violence sparked right here, the shores of Lake Michigan, on July 27, 1919. And nearly 100 years later, the landscape may have changed, but the scars left behind have not. In 1919, troops were coming home from World War I. But those troops were also returning during the largest immigration waves in U.S. history. From 1900 to 1920, the population of America increased by nearly 40%. That made for a fierce competition for jobs, like at the stockyards of South Chicago.
Well, the stockyards with a couple of other major industries in Chicago were one of the gigantic employers, employing several thousand people. Most of them by that time, by 1919, were Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Also, within the last 5 years, African Americans were coming from places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana to northern cities. Mississippians were especially coming to Chicago on the Illinois Central Railroad to get jobs in meatpacking, also in steel, also in the railroads. So you had a bit of sort of forced integration. Sometimes African Americans would also come in to the industry as scabs, as replacement workers. So not only were there these racial tensions, but on top of that, often there were labor tensions that would be created in a place like the meatpacking industry on the South Side.
With those racial and social tensions in the background, a day at the beach ignited a week of intense fighting that left dozens dead and entire neighborhoods burnt.
July 27, 1919, a teenage African-American man by the name of Eugene Williams, who could not swim, was in a bit of a makeshift raft. And he was out on Lake Michigan, and he departed from the 29th Street beach. And this is an era we think of the South as being segregated. Well, in Chicago, none of this was enforced by law, but it was enforced by custom. So there were strict dividing lines between the 26th Street beach, which was for whites, and the 29th Street beach, which was supposed to be for African Americans. Eugene Williams' raft drifted over close enough to 26th Street beach, that is the white beach. People started to notice that basically he was desegregating the water, if that's possible. And some people threw rocks at him. He was eventually hit in the head, and he was still in the water. More rocks were thrown at him, and he eventually drowned. What some African-American beachgoers tried to do is to appeal to, of course, at that time, an all-white Chicago police force. Basically, they got no response. There were no efforts to arrest the whites who threw the rocks. And in fact, as the riots went on, starting with July 27th, went on from there, the police were either non-responsive or, in fact, responsive against the African-American communities of the South Side.
Mobs of mostly young white men terrorized African-American neighborhoods, but violence broke out in all parts of the city.
You see a lot of young people, especially Southsiders, whites, who were getting involved in not just violence, but looting and burning and those kinds of things that we associate with riots in the 21st century.
Confrontations led to the deaths of 25 black and 13 white Chicagoans. Fires or vandalism also left more than 1,000 black families homeless. It was a scene born from poverty, immigration, and our nation's unfortunate relationship with race, a situation poetically summed up by Carl Sandburg, who once worked for the Chicago Daily News.
The riots furnished an excuse for every element of gangland to go for it and test their prowess by the most ancient ordeals of the jungle. So on the one hand, we have blind, lawless government failing to function through policemen ignorant of Lincoln, the Civil War, and Emancipation Proclamation, and a theory sanctioned and baptized in a storm of red blood. And on the other hand, we have a gaunt involuntary poverty from which issues the hoodlum.
Chicago's mayor eventually called in the state militia, which, along with a massive rainstorm, helped calm the situation. The riots were over. The underlying problems remained. As in 1919, then an invisible line, and forced to keep two sets of Americans from becoming one.
Due to the sustained violence and the widespread economic impact, it is considered the worst of the scores of riots and civil disturbances across the United States during the Red Summer of 1919, so named because of its racial and labor violence that was occurring in other communities in Illinois and across the United States. It's known as the worst riot in the history of Illinois. There were also attempts by the ethnic Irish gangs to incite Southern and Eastern European immigrant communities to violence against blacks, although they had no history of hostility. In one instance, members of the Irish Ragans Coat Gang, it was a popular Irish street gang, put on blackface and set fire to a Lithuanian and Polish homes in the back of the yards neighborhoods in an attempt to incite this community to join them against African Americans. So let me say that in plain language. Basically, some Irish gang members put on blackface, went over to the back of the yards community, lit fire to homes that were owned and occupied by Lithuanian and Polish folk, and said that black people did it as a way to gain allyship as they were attacking other African Americans. And that kind of behavior and that kind of nefarious strategical planning to paint Black people in such a negative light and plant seeds that if Black people are around or in your workplace or in your communities or are attending your schools, that it means that it's going to be bad. This type of behavior has been happening for a long time. When we hear political candidates cite rhetoric that underscores this racial tension that did not exist, but that others have incited, it's just caused such harm to the African American community and really to the world, because we haven't really been able to navigate sharing our cultures, our personages, and it being valuable, like you being valuable for who you are and what makes up your culture, your race, your ethnicity, and what makes up people who look like me and our race and our culture and our ethnicity. We haven't really had the opportunity to exist in a equal space to share and to be neighbors and to live and work together, because there's been such negative connotation incited on the presence of Black people. And that is something that I've been fighting my entire life. My family's been fighting its entire life, just trying to live and thrive in the communities that we reside in. So Mayor Thompson, or Big Bill, had a game of brinksmanship with the Illinois governor, Frank Loudon, that may have exacerbated the riot because Thompson refused to ask the governor, Loudon at the time, to send in the Illinois National Guard for those 4 days. Although Loudon had called up the guardsmen and they were organized in the Chicago armories and ready to intervene, the mayor, Big Bill, did not allow, I guess, or call to action or enact whatever the political power that exists to do that. He did not choose to do so. After the riots ended, Governor Loudon convened the Chicago Commission on Race Relations, which was a nonpartisan interracial committee to investigate the causes and to propose solutions to racial tensions. As I reported in episode 3, and if you watched that, and if you haven't, and I'll, put that somewhere in this screen for you to easily get to it if you need to. In episode 3, I introduced you to the Reverend Lacey K. Williams, who was the pastor of the Olivet Baptist Church. He was appointed to that Chicago Commission on Race Relations, along with Robert Sinstack Abbott, which we talked about in episode 1 and a little bit in episode 2, who was the founder of the Chicago Defender newspaper. And we know that the Chicago Defender newspaper had a great role in the Great Migration here in the Chicagoland area. Now, also in 1919, there was a lot of bad things happening, but there was a couple of good things happening. In 1919, real estate broker Archibald Teller opened the first Fannie Mae candy store in Chicago. And Fannie Mae, Pixies, and Dixies are my mother's favorite candy classics. So shout out to Archibald Teller and the Fannie Mae enterprises that are still around today. Now, let's return to the national story. President Wilson had intended to seek a third term in office, but had a stroke in October 19. I mean, there was a lot of stuff happening in 1919. So after the stroke, it left him not capable of running again. And that led to the election of Warren G. Harding as the 29th president of the United States from 1921 until his death in 1923. President Harding was very popular. Some would say too popular, as after his death, many scandals were revealed, such as the Teapot Dome scandal, where Navy petroleum reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming, as well as 2 locations in California, were leased to private oil companies at low rates without competitive bidding. So before Watergate, there was the Teapot Dome scandal. President Harding also became the first American president of the 20th century to openly call for the political equality of Black people in a largely white America. Now, it still had some divisive tenets in it. So let's be clear that even though President Harding used his collective voice and power to talk about it, there still was some divisive tenets as part of that declaration, if you will. But I guess you got to start somewhere. On October 26, 1921, President Harding delivered a speech in Birmingham, Alabama, which condemned lynchings committed primarily by white supremacists against Black Americans in the Deep South and elsewhere. He is quoted as saying, "Whether you like it or not, unless our democracy is a lie, you must stand for that equality." And that brings me to a point. When we talk about democracy, and they speak about it a lot in political campaigns and research documents, and just as we talk about democracy as a concept, it's so interesting how democracy, which means like just open equality and opportunity, how it has such restrictions to it. Like, words mean things, y'all, and it's so challenging to live in a democracy where everyone doesn't have equal opportunity, and that there hasn't been as much needed resources placed into the places and spaces that need them to help them to have better democracy and democratic opportunity, if you will. And I think that because democracy is also wrapped up into like the word democratic and democrat, that it becomes politicized. And I think that people, get kind of turned off around like the political stuff that happens. Civic engagement is at an all-time low. And I think politics and its run and its course that it's run in our history has led to just a lot of apathy, for sure. Let's move to the 1920s. It was a time for modernization in America. The use of electricity became increasingly common. Mass production of motorized vehicles stimulated other industries as well, such as highway construction, rubber, steel, and building. Hotels were being erected to accommodate the tourists that were venturing up the roads now because they had cars. The economic boost helped to bring the nation out of recession. And to improve and expand the nation's highway system, Harding signed the Federal Highway Act of 1921. So from 1921 to 1923, the federal government spent about $162 million, which would be the equivalent of $2.9 billion today, on America's highway system, infusing the U.S. economy with a large amount of capital. In 1922, Harding proclaimed that America was in the age of the motor car, and that the motor car reflected our standards of living and gauges the speed of our present day life. You see what he did there? He was being, kind of poetic in his speech around the motor car. But it made me think, as we, again, are rooting all of this research into a digital equity lens and frame, it made me think about what if this same type of effort that was made for highways was made for fiber across the nation. We are so behind and disconnected from the innovation around treating broadband access, especially through fiber lines, as a utility. So what if previously to this time, fiber and broadband was treated as a utility, and there was this great infrastructure movement to ensure that fiber was laid all across the nation, and our highways are a great place for that to happen. Because I don't know if this happens to you, but I'm recently driving down to Champaign, Illinois, where the University of Illinois is, and the road I-57 that I take from my home to get down there, it has very poor connectivity. So my cell phone doesn't work very well. I was trying to listen to some podcasts and catch up on some things, audiobooks, and the signaling just isn't strong. And so if we had some investment and some leadership around this, maybe our communities wouldn't be as disconnected as they are today. I'm just saying. So, sadly, in 1923, President Harding unexpectedly passed away from a heart condition and was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who served as the 30th president of the United States from 1923 to 1929. Coolidge spoke in favor of the civil rights of African Americans, saying in his first State of the Union address that their rights was just as sacred as those of any other citizen under the U.S. Constitution, and that it was public and a private duty to protect those rights. He signed into law the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans, and oversaw a period of rapid and expansive economic growth known as the Roaring Twenties. He left office with considerable popularity. He gains universal praise for his support of racial equality during a period of heightened racial tension in the nation. Now let's go back to them having to create an act to grant U.S. citizenship to Native Americans. How appropriately inappropriate, considering that we know that these are native lands that we are standing on, living in, but that there had to be a law put in place to grant citizenship rights to Native Americans. This country is something else at times. It just makes me tired sometimes to think about all the things. And history is a great teller of the things. And it's so important to tell the stories and to protect the stories and to protect the storytellers, because these things happened, and all of these decisions that were being made impact things we're doing today. The opportunities of today are here as a result of decisions made in the past. So we have to tell as many of these stories as possible so that we don't lose sight of the fact that there's still a lot of work to do. Okay? Let me return to the local front. Back to old Big Bill, Mayor Thompson. He decided not to run for re-election in 1923, and the Democratic Party stood up a very strong candidate, William E. Dever, and he was elected as the 42nd mayor of the city of Chicago from 1923 to 1927. He had previously served as a judge, and before that, he was a Chicago alderman. Remember, I said a lot of our folks were aldermen or or Cook County commissioners, So Dever's term in office saw many improvements in the city's infrastructure, including the completion of Wacker Drive, the extension of Ogden Avenue, and the straightening of the Chicago River, as well as the construction of the city's first airport, at the time called the Municipal Airport. We now know that as Midway Airport here in Chicago. In 1925, the Goodman Theater was established, And my kiddo attended theater camp in 2023 at the Goodman Theater. There's a connection there. So Mayor Dever would turn his attention to the enforcement of prohibition despite his personal opposition to it. Such enforcement was initially effective, but indifference from government at different levels limited its efficacy, and the lower amount of alcohol increased violence among bootleggers, and Chicagoans just wasn't really feeling it. So Dever lost to Big Bill, who decided he was going to run again in 1927. He lost to Big Bill over this issue. And he is the last Democratic nominee in a partisan Chicago mayoral election to lose to a Republican candidate. Again, no other Republican candidate has sat as the mayor of Chicago since Big Bill, Mayor William Thompson. Now, Dever was never in particularly good health, the historians say. So he retired from politics after he lost the election, and he died of pancreatic cancer 2 years later, unfortunately. So Big Bill began his third and final term as Chicago's last Republican mayor in 1927. Big Bill was busy, y'all. Big Bill was busy. There was I believe a Chicago Tribune article that came out maybe about a month ago that did a profile on some of the most nefarious political characters in Chicago, many of which either went to jail or were tied to organized crime or whatever the case may be. And Big Bill was certainly in that listing, in that article. I'll list that Chicago Tribune article in the notes of the episode for those who are interested. So back to national politics. Herbert Clark Hoover succeeded President Coolidge, who chose not to seek re-election and served as the 31st president of the United States from 1929 to 1933. On taking office, Hoover said that given the chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. We know that poverty and digital adoption, devices, access to technology, and digital skills are tied together. So having this statement from President Hoover showed that there's certainly some feelings and some strategy around addressing poverty in our nation, and we continue to have those conversations today. Having seen the fruits of prosperity brought by technological progress, many shared Hoover's optimism, and the already bullish stock market climbed even higher on Hoover's ascension. Again, technology had started to show up. We had electricity, we had motor cars, we had other things that were happening in the innovation space, in the technology space, if you will, in the engineering space, I'll call it. And that helped to boost the economy. So we now can see that we know that when there's technological advancement, there's also economic opportunity and advancement. So if we can just figure out a way to tie those a little tightly together, a little more tightly together for a community, we can actually maybe see our strongest economy ever and maybe address our poverty issues for good. This optimism concealed several threats to sustained U.S. economic growth, including a persistent farm prices, a saturation of consumer goods like automobiles, and growing income inequality. Most dangerous of all to the economy was excessive speculation that had raised stock prices far beyond their value. So now again, I said, let's get our economy aligned. There are things that happen that misalign our economy that put us back into recessive states. So we have to figure out a better way of navigating that and ensuring that our leaders and our decision makers who are elected to ensure that we don't slide into recessive states make better and more informed decisions around how we stabilize our economy. Some regulators and bankers had warned Hoover and President Coolidge before him that a failure to curb speculation would lead to one of the greatest financial catastrophes that the country has ever seen. But both presidents were reluctant to become involved with workings of the Federal Reserve System, which regulated the banks. We have to always talk about money when we're talking about the economy. We talk about money a lot and resources, or the lack thereof of resources, in the digital equity space, and how that impacts our economic status, our economic stability and ability. We're going to have another episode that talks about our economy as it pertains to digital equity in a future episode. So I'll save all those good tidbits of information for that episode. But know that we're going to talk about it because I think that it's relevant. It's a relevant, very relevant conversation, especially in lieu of the Digital Equity Act that was passed by President Biden and the influx of recovery funds that have come into communities through ARPA, as well as these grant opportunities that have come from NTIA. We'll talk about that in a future episode. In late October 1929, the stock market crashed. So all of the smart folks that was like, hey, President Hoover, hey, President Coolidge, y'all gotta stop over-promising what's happening economically speaking, because if we don't, there's going to be a big catastrophe. And in fact, that catastrophe happened in 1929. And the worldwide economy began to spiral downward into the Great Depression. So the Great Depression happened between 1929 and 1939. And it was the severe global economic downturn that affected many countries across the world. It became evident after a sharp decline in stock prices in the United States, the largest economy in the world at the time, that was leading to a period of economic depression. It led to a period of economic depression. The economic contagion began around September 1929 and led to the Wall Street stock market crash of October, called Black Tuesday. This crisis marked the start of a prolonged period of economic hardship characterized by high unemployment rates and widespread business failures. So again, the Great Migration happening, the economic downturn happening, other immigrants from other places coming into the United States and in the Chicagoland area specifically that I'm talking about, still happening. All of these things happening, racial tension happening. There was so much happening. And then all of these political leaders and these new laws and these new plans, all of that stuff contributed. All of that stuff contributed to what was happening in Chicago at the time. Now, we're going to end this on a positive note. One mark of the cultural progress that happened during this time was the Chicago Defenders' annual Bud Billiken Day Parade and Picnic. It was a response to the Great Depression, where this youth-focused event had become a treasured and is still a treasured community institution. Now, during my time at Smart Chicago Collaborative, we actually partnered with the Chicago Defender Charities and ABC News to create a digital text solution for the Bud Billiken Floats and Parade participant voting. Every team and float participant were numbered, and those teams and floats moved past the media booth. The media personalities would state the name and give instructions on how to vote for who you thought was the best booth or the best float or the best, parade participant. There was also a ticker that ran on that live broadcast that gave instructions on how to text, vote for your favorite vote or team participant. So I am part of that kind of historical space with the Bud Billiken Parade, with my work with Smart Chicago and us presencing a text solution for their participant voting. So that ends this timeline discussion around the Great Migration and who else was here in Chicago when the migrants arrived, and what was also happening in the political landscapes, what was happening in the political landscape, both nationally and locally. We'll pick up with the second phase of the Great Migration and what was happening and who was here in our next episode. But for now, this is episode 4. Tune in for episode 5 to complete the rest of this story. Thank you for listening, and please share this episode and all of the episodes of the Digital Determinants Podcast in your networks. And as always, y'all stay connected.